Hi, my name is Jim Fager with the Greater Louisville Education Cooperative. While most everyone agrees it's important to support our students' social and emotional well-being, not everyone is clear how best to accomplish this for most students, let alone students with disabilities. There are four prioritized practices that, when combined, provide school teams with the tools they need to create and maintain safe, equitable, and inclusive learning environments for everyone. If you have about 10 minutes, I'd like to share with you how functional behavior assessments, behavior intervention plans, manifestation determination reviews, and even threat assessment work together and why they are so important. Now, to appreciate this, we're going to have to go back almost 300 years. Do you recognize this man? Well, his name is Friedrich Froebel. Does that help you? Well, you may not recognize him, but I'm sure you're going to recognize his impact. Although he was an educator and a theorist, his ideas impacted the worlds of abstract art and even architecture. Where we're most familiar with him is with the ideas that he pioneered, especially around mental models creating structures for learning. He argued that enriched learning environments play a critical role in learning by capitalizing on the brain's tendency to process new information in a deep way. Froebel said learning is made easy through the kindergarten. Now you know it, or the children's garden. In Froebel's model, educators cultivate their classrooms much like gardeners cultivate the soil. And when learning environments are structured like this, there's little need for reactive and stress-reducing strategies that avoid survival thinking, what we now know as neural downshifting. Of course, this describes the ideal. So what happens when the garden that you imagined is not the garden that you experienced? Well, according to the National Education Association, approximately half of all new teachers leave the profession within 5 years. Idealism can give way to discouragement when teachers discover very soon, well, not every student wants to be educated. Now, this may be hard to imagine, but practices do exist that support the learning needs of our most challenging students. But alternatives are often hard to see unless we're willing to look at these challenges from a different perspective. Holding on to Froebel's model of education, think about schools as gardens, and our students, like the healthiest of plants, may require dramatically different approaches to thrive. Let me illustrate this with a true story. Several years ago, I worked at a group home in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Now, I was born and raised in the shadow of New York City, so imagine the surprised and skeptical looks I got when I decided to try my hand at growing a garden. Folks passed by and made what I thought were the nicest of comments. Look at Jim, he's planting a garden, bless his heart. And as you can imagine, and they predicted, my first attempt at gardening, it didn't go well at all. What I wanted to grow didn't, and the things that I didn't want to grow, they took over the garden. It was a mess. Then an older man dressed in overalls walked up to me working in the garden one day, and after a long pause, he said, "Garden ain't doing too good." Now, lots of words flew through my head. I am a New Yorker, but common sense prevailed, and through gritted teeth, I said, "No, no, it's not." And then, after another long pause, the old man said, "Well, have you sampled your soil?" "Have I what?" "Sampled your soil," he replied. "Take some soil samples from your garden and take it to the extension office. They'll tell you exactly what you need." Well, I did just what the old farmer said, and what a difference it made. And that next season, my garden grew like gangbusters. Now, I could have easily given up. I could have blamed the soil for not being good enough to grow decent plants. But the reality is, it's not the soil's responsibility to change its composition and meet the needs of the gardener. It's the gardener's responsibility to change practices and meet the needs of the soil. So what about our students with social and emotional needs that go beyond what's typical? Well, this is where our gardening lens meets good science. You see, ability alone does not define student readiness. Students with complex and varied experiences require varied and skilled instructional frameworks, individualized approaches, perhaps even special plans to achieve those required outcomes. In other words, we need to hone our gardening practices and add to our pedagogical tool shed. So here's the perspective shift. FBAs, BIPs, MDRs, these are not strategies to remove a student. No, by no means. Instead, working with your school's multi-tiered systems of support, functional behavior assessments and manifestation determinations, behavior plans, even threat assessment help keep students in school by ensuring learning environments are safe, predictable, and equitable. This practice is what John Hattie coined as visible learning, and it works best when we adopt it. That is, we start viewing learning experiences through the eyes of our students. Remember, what adults see as being something simple, safe, or meaningful, students may see as complicated, threatening, or irrelevant. So a critical task of educator is creating learning experiences that students see as meaningful, safe, and accomplishable. Now, adopting a problem-solving approach means being willing to view student behavior, even threatening student behavior, from a radically different perspective. A perspective that acknowledges that every child's experiences and resources vary, and all children benefit from adults willing to see the world from their perspective and partner with them to problem solve their challenges. Now, I believe, and I hope you do too, if we think about it, children are not born disruptive. They're not born violent. Delinquency is not an inherited trait. Student disruption and threats should not be viewed as unchangeable. Instead, problem behavior should be viewed as giant red flags waved by our students, signaling, help, I have a problem that I cannot solve. Now, supporting our students' social and emotional needs is a critical next step for educators, but it's been slow to take root. Why is that? Well, mostly because of faulty assumptions that we may hold as educators. For example, we may assume that social challenges students face are simple, and therefore they don't need nor should they get extra support. Or maybe we believe students should already know how to navigate social emotional problems, or it's not the educator's place to teach social supports, or maybe students should just learn to navigate social emotional challenges the good old-fashioned and hard way. Now, assumptions like these would never be tolerated in academic areas. Why are social emotional supports any different? The simple reality is when problems exceed everyone's ability to solve or cope, we experience stress. And stress at high levels will signal our brains that we're under threat. And our brains will then carry out a threat response protocol that will precipitate either fear, and anger, or both, and prepare you to do one or more of these three actions: fight, flight, or freeze. Even recognizing stress drives student behaviors that are not willful or intentional, it only tells part of the story. Our perspective shift must go further. Here's a familiar analogy, and it serves as a good starting point for a complicated conversation. All students have inherent ability, but not all students have inherent opportunity. Reality is, not all of our students begin life on a level ground. We don't all have the same opportunities. Similarly, barriers our students must overcome also vary. So students' ability to access resources vary considerably. Considering these three variables, where can we best affect change? Well, obviously, equitable access and instructional supports. But when addressing behavior, where have we historically put most of our focus? On student characteristics. And that's the one variable we have no influence to change. Now, I know it can be tempting to become very focused on the things we cannot change and conclude there's little we can do to help our challenged students. But that would be a whole lot like the gardener blaming the soil. Your school's multi-tiered systems of supports are designed to help you bridge that gap between student characteristics, equitable access, and instructional supports. So opportunities for student success will be driven by the student need toward that common goal, which we all hold, which is high student achievement. MTSS is an umbrella term, and it's designed to cover the array of social, emotional, and behavior supports that optimize student learning. All students, including students with disabilities, work within these frameworks. All students benefit from practices that support social and emotional well-being. And because students with disabilities have established disadvantages, a problem-solving structure exists to ensure equitable outcomes, especially when the areas of concern are not academic. So remember, all students are general education students first. Special education is a support for students and is not intended to be a separate educational experience. Using Froebel's model, consider special education as a greenhouse that's designed to accelerate growth. The IEP is the scaffold between a student's current skills and their grade level standards. Special education is designed to be time limited whenever possible. And just as plants in a greenhouse are intended to return to the main garden, the intent of special education is to optimize a student's participation in the general education curriculum. So let's bring it all back full circle. What do FBAs, BIPs, threat assessment, what do they have in common? Each of these frameworks employs a problem-solving approach to identify strategies that support students with disabilities. Your district has prioritized these practices to strengthen our pedagogical toolshed and support equitable behavior outcomes for students with disabilities. And by employing a problem-solving approach, FBAs help identify what purpose a student's behavior serves to meet that student's needs. And behavior plans help you identify a replacement behavior that serves the same purpose but is much more adaptive. In other words, we can all live with it. Manifestation determinations provide that protective checkpoint that compels a positive look at student behavior and an IEP review. And threat assessment, well, that helps school teams avoid overreactions to student behavior by ensuring safety and identifying interventions that reduce risk. Underneath the MTSS umbrella, a significant paradigm shift in education is underway. Student fit within a learning environment no longer drives educational decisions. Instead, instructional fit that cultivates safe, predictable, and equitable learning environments, supporting student need, collectively lifts the learning outcomes for all of our students. Thank you.